Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by learning to develop yourself, your skills, your network, and more. I'm Brian, your host. All right, today on the Develop Yourself podcast, we have another Brian, who's a founder, mentor, recent guest at Parsity, recurring guest at Parsity. I'm going to talk a little bit about his interesting journey from self-taught developer to IBM to founder to doing mentorship and advice you have for up-and-coming developers. Welcome to the show.
Brian, I'm very happy to be here. This is wonderful.
Yeah, you recently spoke at Parsity just before we got on here. We were speaking about that, and it was great. I mean, you had a really great take on getting your first job, no nonsense advice for people coming up. And you have a really interesting story yourself. So before I get into like the advice you have for people and what you'd suggest for people that are on the job market learning to code, I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about how you went from basically self-taught developer, right, to IBM, and not just at IBM, you went up to engineering manager at IBM.
Right.
Yeah, which is a pretty wild story. How'd that happen?
Right. So I'll start back. So if I had to start my development journey, I'll start on the failed attempts basically to get into development along my career. And I probably got interested in engineering, at least the idea of getting into the engineering and software development, and really a little bit of middle school, but really high school. And actually, it's like, my father has given me lots of wonderful pieces of advice over the years. He was a great business mentor to me, but honestly, he gave me a piece of advice that ended up not helping me out, which was I was interested in high school learning programming, and I wanted to go to a programming course there. And he actually told me, no, don't do that. Now, that seems odd today, right? That seems like something like no one would say that today. But the reason why is because back in the 2000s, and again, he was starting his business, he was looking at development, the outsourcing of development was just starting, right? The World is Flat was a very, very influential book. It was talking about how skills were going to get distributed. Mm-hmm. And so for him, he saw most skills were going overseas. So he just kind of played that out in his head and said, look, most development makes sense to be outsourced, and we're not really sure if it's going to be worth paying somebody in the United States a six-figure salary when you can pay someone overseas $15K, right? The economics right there. So he actually steered me away from that. And he steered me into do business, do operations, right? Which ended up being a really good decision. That's what I do for my job now. But back then, I said, okay, I didn't do that. And then I went to college, studied economics, didn't do development. And I graduated. I was first a salesperson, and I was in operations, my family business, effectively a glorified BA. And I just had this yearning. This was in 2010, where it's like, man, I really want to learn development. And so when I started off, I tried doing some of the things that were available. This was before MOOCs, right? MOOCs, I think they called them.
Yeah, right.
Then, right.
So, massive online courses.
Right, exactly. And I did some of those I did the early programs, that were online, where it's like, hey, do JavaScript in your screen, right? And it worked. Nothing really ever clicked. Mm-hmm. And then eventually I ended up having a chance to go to this program at MIT called the Entrepreneurial Development Program. They still host this, part of their executive MBA program. I remember going there. I was like 23 years old. I was in the room with like the CEO of HP Europe and like these guys who were running business. And I'm just this, kid, basically.
That's
right?
Awesome.
In this room and do it. It was a wonderful experience. But my goal was like, okay, I'm interested in being in tech. I want to be in a tech company. So I'm going to go find a co-founder. That's my idea. Right. And I ended up talking to a bunch of engineers, a bunch of folks there. It was wonderful. But I got done, and it really just kind of dawned on me where it's like, man, I really don't have much use for a 23-year-old business, right?
Yeah.
And it left me, and it's like, man, if I really want to be in tech, I got to learn it myself. So I took it seriously at that point. I went home, looked at all the courses that were available, and eventually found a free book that was online by an author named Zed Shaw called Learn Python the Hard Way. And this was back with Python 2. And literally it was just a free book. And the thing I liked about it was, one, Learn Python the Hard Way made sense to me because well, I tried the easy way and that didn't work. So, and I'm serious, so let's try the hard way.
Yeah.
2, actually took you through a lot of the setup to get running on your own system. Because I think the reason I failed on studying so many things, because I tried learning Visual Basic and that didn't work. I tried learning JavaScript. It never felt real because you were always within these confined spaces on like the internet, right? Where I'm typing a browser, but I'm like, okay, well, I want to run something that's actually real. I want to build a real website. I want to build these things. And that never got you there. Here it was literally okay, we're going to download the Python script. Now we're going to get the terminal up. Now we're going to learn how to go through it. And I mean, literally, I spent 300 hours studying that over the next 2 months. I
Oh,
timed
wow.
myself. I saw how much time I was putting in. I was really determined. And like probably 50 to 100 hours of that was just getting the console up and running, being able to run a Python script and just get to hello world, let alone everything else.
All from a
So
book,
when I
right?
got
There's no videos either back then, really, to
there was
watch
no
either.
there was
So
no
straight
videos. It was
book.
just a book.
Yeah.
No boot camps were really
No boot
available at this
camps.
time.
Yep.
Honestly, like the first set of boot camps, like when like Aaron, Aaron started his boot camp, and Harsh Patel was another person I worked for. He started was it Iron Yard or
Hack
yeah,
Reactor.
Hacked Reactor. That's it, right.
Yeah.
He was there. That was all like right around the time I was learning, but those were all in like San Francisco and Austin and
Yep.
sexy places, not Indianapolis, Indiana,
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
or we wouldn't get our boot camp for another 3 years or so. So I learned that. And so when I got done with that, I was a really, really crappy programmer, but I was like able to do stuff. So I was able to go back to my family business. And at that point, I started learning a little bit of SQL, a little bit of development, but really like 80 stuff. And then really my plan is like, okay, I want to be an engineer. I'm just going to keep working my way through, better and better jobs. And that really became the skill set I really honed in, which is go in, learn an experience, find the next place I want to go, figure out what I have to learn, get the experience, and keep rolling my way into better jobs. So I started off as, for my family business as a glorified BA. Most of the development work was done by other folks, and I'm very grateful for that. And we got to work in. Then I was a BI writer for a healthcare startup in Indianapolis. And I was a little bit closer to the material. So that's when I learned Python. I learned a little bit more SQL. I became really great friends with bunch of brilliant software, developers who were all in DevOps, actually. Like that
Okay.
was their field. And like one guy who was there just loved Linux. Like he studied it like a religion almost, right? And he gave me all those books. So I said, okay, he's really smart. I want to be working with these guys. So I studied those books, got more skills, eventually left that job and actually leaving my job for a thing. We'll get into that in a minute because I have advice on how to leave your job without having another job. And I did this one poorly, but left, got a role where I was a BI writer, but I was dealing more with data structures. And again, it was the exact same thing where it's like, great, I'm here now. What do I need to learn next? I taught myself AWS. The company paid for me to get my AWS solution architect when that was early on. Got that, worked my way into infrastructure roles, and then eventually took some time off, started working in crypto and in that space for about a year and a half or so. And then when I came back from that, my family decided to move from Indianapolis, where we were originally, down to Raleigh. And I had basically at that point no network in Raleigh. Went to UNC Chapel Hill, but I didn't really have a professional network. So that was the one where I really honed in on, okay, I need to have a job without a network. What do I do? And that's when I honed in a lot of the skills. Like the presentation I gave to to Parsity a few weeks ago was really based on what did I learn there? How did I get a job? How did I hone in my resume? And then ultimately, I was very lucky. I ended up getting a DevOps role at IBM. And that's when I considered like I made it. And that was like in 2019. And within 2 years of that, I ended up becoming an engineering manager for the team, which is record pace. Like my director thought I would have been available to do or would have been ready to be a manager this year, but for 2024. But
but 5 years
opportunity
earlier.
struck. Yeah, I got a lot earlier and it worked. And then that ended up spanning my technical career, and I learned a lot along the way.
Wow, that's a heck of a speed run.
It was very lucky. And I think the reason is because I didn't have that traditional background. I never really felt comfortable and safe in any role that I had. I never had any illusions that my job was secure wherever I was. I always knew it's like, and especially, and this is probably a lot of my business background, which is, look, I need to be providing value. I need to have a reason that, yes, it's great that my boss likes me and I do good stuff for the client, but I also need to make sure the skills are there. Everything is aligned. I mean, like it's almost like a relationship, right? Where it's like, if you're dating someone or you're married, it's like, hey, if that individual really likes you and you have a good marriage and you got the soft skills right of your relationship, that's
Sure.
great. But if you're broke, if you're overweight, if you have a bad personality, even if that person loves you, eventually those things are going to wear. And it's like, well, you could gamble that the soft skills are going to pick up on it, or you can get the hard stuff right. And then you can live and say it's this soft, you can say it is the soft skills that end up getting you, but it's the hard skills. So for me, I was always picking out where it's okay, if I were to get kicked out here.
Hmm.
Why? Because, well, I don't have this skill set. I don't have this. So it's like, okay, what am I going to do to learn the next set of skills, the next set of things so that I'm prepared to take those on? And like when I was at Apparatus, which eventually became Bertusa, that was kind of my thing where it's like, I'm a BI writer. I didn't think of myself as expendable, but I knew it's like, this is not as strong of a skill set as I would like,
Yeah.
but they need AWS folks. Cloud is starting to get into the enterprise in a big way. There's lots of work there. So I knew, hey, if I learned how to be able to scale up cloud infrastructure, if I learned this puts me in a much better place. And so I ended up being very lucky here. I ended up having 5 weeks of no client work. So I literally just spent 40 hours a week studying for that test, got it done in about 5 weeks. By the next week, I was literally in DC for Gannett Public, Gannett, which does USA Today and publishing there, advising them on cloud infrastructure. And then by the next year, I was working for A&E Media as a serverless solution architect
Wow.
for them. And that's a whole different, how I got that had nothing to do with my job there. That happened, that was my happenstance there, but ended up being a great opportunity. But it was because I was always looking at side projects and additional things to learn and just figuring out what can I do to build myself up.
Man, that is, it's cool because you have a really amazing story, but a lot of the core things you did are similar across people that I've looked at that I consider successful. Doing
Yeah.
side projects, kind of taking some gambles, it sounds like, on a few trends, right? You're looking at macro, micro trends like AWS, you're pretty early into that, it sounds like. And then you got a huge reward for putting some effort into there.
Yeah. And what I came to was I ended up having this model. And the way I think is generally in models and frameworks is what I do today for my
Mhm.
clients at Lucid, right? I have business models and growth models that I used to think through. And this was no different. So I kind of broke up technology into three buckets on how I would think about it. And this ended up serving me pretty well. So you have the foundational, really boring, really useful things. You have the things that are useful to get a job today. And then you have experimental technology that is kind of out there, but new and up and coming. Generally speaking, people only focus on the middle bucket when they're trying to get a job, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm going to learn React. I'm going to learn these things. And
Sure.
those are good. That's what you need. That's what's marketable. That's when you go out and put out a resume. That's what they're going to ask you about. And that tends to be, 5 years, let's say every 5 years or so, maybe, kind of changes over to a new tech stack or something else.
Mhm.
It's starting to get longer now. It used to move over faster like a decade ago, but now I'm starting to notice this tech stack is getting more stable. So that may not be as true now, but those are things where like, it's really good, but often they're like implementations of core technology, right? Like said, like React is a technology that is really fundamentally based off of JavaScript and how do and things that work inside of, modern web browser. So it's the current implementation. It's really good at getting you a job. But if you were like a React expert, you spent a year studying React and
Mhm.
just React, well, you understand how that framework works, but you're not necessarily learning the foundational stuff, right? So I've seen people here who are experts in the implement, in the frameworks or implementation that then move over and they kind of get thrown, right?
Oh
They
yeah,
don't
for
always
sure.
get very close to the metal. So that's what you need to get a job. But then you split off into the two sides. Let's start with the foundational stuff. The foundational stuff is things that you will almost never get hired off of direct. It's like learning Linux, raw JavaScript skills. I kind of put SQL development in that sort of thing. They are things that are very useful to know and unlock a whole bunch of understanding for the middle tier, right? Because here's the thing, if you understand React, you can build a React website, that's good. But if you understand how a modern web browser actually processes and how it actually does its work, if you understand how JavaScript fundamentally operates, right? If you understand some of these frameworks that exist in the industry to explain that, it won't necessarily get you a job. Like if you just knew that, you'd be like, well, right, we need a React developer.
For sure.
It all of a sudden, it makes you way stronger in those current things because now that I understand how the web browser operates and how JavaScript works, all of a sudden I now know what React's doing, which means that if it throws me a weird problem or I want to do something, you have a much deeper skill set to be able to go and operate from, and it makes you a lot stronger. That's one side. And that's one of those things that I always recommend where it's like, you always have something like that that's going on where it's like, you're always learning Linux or learning some DevOps skills that or something else because it really rounds you out and it really is foundational. Then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is really new, exciting technology that not a lot of people are using. This is your blockchain developer.
Yeah.
This is your AI developer. This is your
Rust,
quantum
maybe.
computing,
Yeah.
right? Right. Maybe Rust is actually moving into
Get to be a
kind of
macro
the
trend.
center right now.
Yeah. Right.
Right. And doing that. But Rust, when it first started, absolutely fits into that. And that is the area of like lowest chance of probability that you'll get something, but the highest opportunity value here. And I'll use a personal example to explain this. So back in 2016, January of 2016, my wife had just bought me an Echo. And I really like, this was a cool device.
Mm-hmm.
I was big on it. And I always come up with big visions of what this could be. And it's incredible because it ended up like Amazon's losing like $10 billion a year on this thing. So like, it's crazy. It's a good bet. It was a good bet, but it's not panning out. But back then we didn't really know. So I thought, that's really cool. I want to develop apps for this thing. And so I remember January 2016, I took a month off and I was like, I'm going to learn this. In order to do that, I had to learn how Alexa operated and how their model for taking in, written words and doing that. Their API was really easy to use. I had to learn serverless apps at that time, right? So I had to learn how to deploy a serverless application. I was using DynamoDB. I was using things. I can't think of the name of the serverless processing framework. I'll think of it in a moment when I stop trying to think of it. But I learned all these things, and it's like it was good. And I was able to get like 6 of the first apps that were available on the Alexa store were basically from me. I think I was like number 300 was the first one I threw out there on the store. Right. And these weren't really complicated apps, but it was enough that I got my feet wet. I was figuring out what it looked like and I deployed it and, it was good. Well, so this goes back to how I got to work in New York. My company I worked at, Apparatus, I got acquired by a company called Virtusa. And if you're not familiar with kind of M&A cycles, right, there's kind of this thing where when you get acquired as a company, there's usually about an 18-month period where nothing really changes. And then like, if it's really standard, like to the day, 18 months in, a bunch of changes happened, right? And so really that time came later that year. I think it was closer to December. And of course they were announcing layoffs, right? Or whatever. We got consulted, we got bought out.
Yeah.
We were getting acquired. They were making cuts there. And so like, I was going out in this group and there was about 40 of us on the consulting side of it where we weren't sure if we were going to have, roles or not. I was lucky that I didn't get laid off, but I remember there was this internal job board to be able to apply to jobs inside of Virtusa.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was like a serverless role. And I thought there's virtually no chance of me actually getting this, but I went off and applied anyway. Right. And I applied to this. Well, next thing I know, my boss is coming up to me, a gentleman named Eric Clark. He's off at Google now. One of the best bosses I ever had. Came to me, he was like, so this guy in New York wants to talk to you about serverless. I'm like, serverless, really? He's like, yeah, I did. So had this resume, had AWS, had all these things, but he wanted to talk about that.
Yeah.
So I get on the call with him and he starts questioning me about serverless. And this was my technical interview. He was literally asking me like, oh, what are the run times that run on this platform? Like, what is the timeout? Like really
Trivia
101
stuff. Mm-hmm.
Right. It wasn't that difficult. But the fact is that they sold this client on serverless. They didn't have anyone who could do that in their network, but I could, and I could reasonably do it. I had the background, I had AWS certification. So like next thing I knew, I was kind of like, I told them it's like, hey, I can't live in New York. My family lives in Indianapolis, can't. And they're like, that's fine. We'll fly you out every other week. Are you okay with that? I'm like, yeah, I'm okay. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Right.
So that started my year. And that was in 2017 where literally I'd have a week at home. Then I spent a week in New York. That was, basically I had an Airbnb in Midtown, basically. That was literally a block and a half from where I worked out of. And I had I knew the lady who rented it. It was almost always available. So I would stay Midtown and I would go work there. And I was a serverless and I was their serverless architect.
That's amazing.
Problems like that. I went to there.
Yeah.
Right. But that's the nature of that end of the bell curve, right? So like if I was talking to folks that were coming out of like Parsity bootcamp,
yeah, right,
that would not be the thing I would tell them to invest a significant amount of time in initially, because that's not what they need, right? Usually if you're coming out, what's your goal? I want to have a stable income stream. I want to have good future opportunities. I want to have good experiences. So you're really focused on the middle of that curve, which is, well, learn the most popular frameworks, learn them well, get experience working on these things, build out your network. And then we start to get into more career opportunity sort of things. But then occasionally you'll get out where it's like somebody has that and like, hey, I'm looking for more exciting opportunities. What can I do? And it's like, well, if you're interested in blockchain, if you are a smart contract developer, it's the same sort of dynamic where it's like it's a technology that is not super interesting to most people at the beginning. It's
Hmm.
only really the nerds. All of a sudden, the value proposition hits for some reason. Some market blows up, some new set of products launch, some cost saving all of a sudden becomes very attractive. And now you go from 10 companies needing this to 100. And
Yeah.
guess what? The number of people who know it doesn't grow by 10x. It grows almost not at all, right?
Hmm.
So you end up moving from a place where you can't find a lot of jobs to, if you have that skill, it blows up. And this is what you saw in like, the Web3 industry. Smart contract developers went from getting paid a good salary, right? It would have been like, but closer to like 200, quarter of a million back in
It's
like
like
2018.
astronomical. I saw it
Right,
on certain platforms. I
right.
was like blown away by how much they were offering people. I'm like, this is nuts.
No, it was, I had to confirm this multiple times because it would be inappropriate for me to tell your audience this if it weren't true and I hadn't heard it. One person I knew or one company was offering $1 million a year for a senior engineer,
Oh my
not a
God.
manager, not a thing, $1 million a year that for a full time. It was a
Individual
joke.
contributor, just writing code.
An individual contributor
Wow.
writing code,
That's
but it was a
amazing.
smart contract developer. There was another gentleman I met at a conference who had been riding this wave, and he was like, "You know what? I'm not really interested in working a full time job. I'm looking to work part time, 20 hours, and I'm not asking much. All I'm asking for is $300,000 a year." That's not a joke. He was not putting me up. He was not
Just with
doing
a
it. It
straight
was
face.
that was a straight face, and he wasn't lying. That was what the market did, right? And so, if you learn some of these skills and you invest in them, you can often there's a lot of benefit. There's a lot of benefits that often you can become top of your field quite quickly. Because again, the example I use is if you try to go out and become the best SQL developer in the world, and even if you pick a platform, if you want to do Redshift, right? If you end
Yeah.
up being a developer there or whatever, you're competing against people who have been in the field for a decade.
Decades.
If you
Yeah.
go after right, if you go after something like MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server, you're going against people who've been there 25 years. So the amount of time you need to take to become a top performer is going to be maybe a decade, maybe two. However, if smart contracts have only existed for 2 years and you spend a year learning it, that means the top people have been in there for 3 years. You've been in there for 1 year. All of a sudden, your value increases dramatically. That's why new fields tend to have like very rich 20 somethings, right? It's because
Yeah.
they ended up moving at the right point. They ended up getting lucky. They were still skilled, right? They're not unskilled folks, right? Certainly some of them get lucky, but they ended up being very good very early and they ended up just riding the wave, right? But again, that doesn't always happen. AR and VR is one of those fields I've been watching for years where it's like, it's an interesting technology. It's a completely new field. It, like you can like the type spatial computing and computing in 3D, especially visually, right?
Hmm.
Where I'm supposed to live in this space and do that is a very different stack, which means that you're going to be using different skills, which means there's not a lot of people who can do it today. And it's like, to me, it's like, that seems like a field that seems ripe for, one of these one of these talent crunches, as I call them, to happen. But of course, hasn't happened yet. Vision Pro hit. And again, maybe 3 years from now, it'll hit off, right,
Yeah.
to do
Right.
this, but it exploded right there. So like, there's another world where smart contracts never took off. And those same people who were making $1 million a year are right now, making like 150 or getting less,
Yeah,
than
for
that
sure.
because it didn't take off.
Man, that is really good advice in general. I've kind of taken that same advice and kind of applied it to my career. Not as much. So I think I
Mhm.
need to take more of these smaller bets because that's a really good insight there. And you ran a Web3 crypto boot camp as well, right? You were
That's right. Yeah.
capitalizing on that gold rush for a bit.
Yeah, we did. Well, actually, it turns out, again, this is the risk because we thought it was a gold rush, or at least we thought it was there, and
Yeah.
it wasn't. That's where you're starting to move away from the engineering problem and the nature of the market. We started off in that space looking at it's like a lot of people want to learn. There's a lot of opportunity here. There's a lot of opportunity for new folks. And so we started off the boot camp to give people solidity skills. And I wrote the curriculum, I built it up, ran the first cohort, graduated our students, and they're all now working in Web3. So it was successful. But by the time we actually finished in 2022, market died, right? And this wasn't just us. Like, the other company I joined afterwards doing growth for them actually closed down their boot camp as well because they just stopped seeing the flow,
Yeah.
right? So even if on the long term you're correct, right? That you can look at the long eye and see, or the long line and see, okay, it's going to increase. There's a good likelihood of happening. and that's true, you can still hit a downturn, right?
Oh
You can
yeah.
be Amazon in 2001 giving a speech trying to defend the internet as a whole. I mean, that's a speech Jeff Bezos had to give where he basically said he's defending the existence of the internet not being a fad, right? And he ended up being right. That didn't matter in 2001,
Yeah.
because you had this crash. You had a lot of people do all the .coms were exploding. And it's like, yeah, he had a bad point. He just had a company that could survive that, and he built a company that survived that.
Yeah, good point. It's funny because these cycles, it's funny how these cycles continue. Now I'm sure I know there's a lot of people out there think AI, layoffs. Is this the worst
Yeah.
time to learn programming? And I kind of see it as maybe one of the better times to learn. While you, one, drive away people that weren't as serious and also get ready for what looks to be potentially another boom. And no one can tell the future, but it does seem like we're primed for potentially another, boom cycle in development.
You go through these cycles. And again, when you're talking about the micro state, and I usually hate talking about the micro state because you can be like right on the long term and totally wrong on the short term, right? But you get paid in the short term, right? That's where it exists.
Yeah.
So like everyone's feeling the crunch right now, but everyone kind of forgets that, hey, in 2020, 2021, the capital markets got flushed with cash and there's a lot of cheap money flying around. A lot of companies looked out and said, hey, we need to, strengthen the company. Cash is cheap to get, so we don't need cash. What we need is people. So they over invested in their people. They got a lot of folks to come in. And then at the same time, they were dealing with this work at home situation where as organizations, they didn't know how to manage that. So they didn't have a lot of folks coming in to, they didn't know how to, deal with that. So they ended up overhiring. We had not even a downturn, just a slowdown. They realized, oh, our balance sheet isn't looking good. We're carrying too many people. So you end up getting a cut. Overall, the trajectory is we're becoming more digital, not less digital. We need more software development, not less.
Yeah.
That's the long-term trend where it's going. It's just the question is whether or not, and if you're an individual looking at this, what do I do? If you have the ability to be able to go and learn and build your skills and position yourself to get through the hard time, you will have the opportunity to take advantage of this when the times are good, right?
Oh yeah.
Like the mistake most people make is they wait until times are good to get started. But that's not how talent development works. Most of the time, if you want to get good at something, like I said, there's a lot you can learn over a course of 3 months to kind of prep yourself.
Mhm.
But a lot of the social proof that you're good comes from experience, and that takes time to do. A lot of the additional learning that actually takes you from a beginner to a mid-level or a senior happens in that interim. And often when people are like hiring people, like when people are hiring smart contract developers, basically off the street, they weren't looking for people who had just started. They were looking for people who had experience. Even if it was just 2 years, they were looking for that experience. So if you see a boom, you say, oh, now's the time that I go in there. You're really not priming yourself for this boom. You might get a job happen. You're really priming yourself for the next one.
Next one,
if
right?
you can continue. If you can continue.
Yeah, right. Yeah, good point on that. And I know it's hard because people are all sorts of fears about, doing this, whether it's a degree or a boot camp or self-teaching or whatever. I want to do a little bit of a thought exercise with you, or maybe
Please.
just get your advice on this. So pretend I'm a boot camp graduate, right? Got out of a boot camp, learned your typical MERN stack. I'm out on the market. What do I do now? I went from, let's say, a French fry chef, and now I'm trying to reposition myself as a software engineer. What advice do you have for that person? What do I do?
Oh man, this is not a thought experiment. This is something I've had to say hundreds of times to folks. So the first thing you have to recognize is that you are selling something, right? That's what you're doing. You have a product. The product is your labor, and you have a bunch of buyers on the market. And again, at the end of the day, it all comes back to that economics curve, supply and demand. Generally speaking, if you have a lot of competition, and if you're new, you're going to have, you tend to have a lot. You're going to have to basically work the game, right? It's not going to be something where you can walk into 5 interviews and get a job. Sometimes that can happen, usually not. First thing you need to do is really understand that you're in the grind at that point. It's the grind of how do I position my resume as good as possible? How do I go to and find companies? How do I consistently stay up with this to be able to do this? You're playing that game, right? So generally speaking, that's the first thing where it's like, you need to recognize you're there. Second thing you need to realize is that experience is what really matters. That's the thing you're trying to get. Usually when people come out of boot camps and are looking to apply, some recognize this, right? And they say, well, should I go off and do work and experience? I'm thinking that's good. We'll get to that in a moment. But there is no point in trying not to at least start applying to jobs and go there if you can do it quickly. Often, like I said, just like with a startup, what do? You create a product, you create your marketing campaign, you create your sales pitch, your offer, and you go out and you test it, right?
Yeah.
You put out, you put out the product, you go talk to potential customers, you get feedback and see, are they interested in me? If they say yes, congratulations. Now you're on to the next game, right? You're doing that. For people who are just getting out, it makes sense to go out and just start applying to see what's true about your particular industry or your particular area, right? Because again, students coming out, Parsity is a nationwide, they're in different areas. What's true for Raleigh may not be true for New York or Seattle or Indianapolis or Austin or any place else. So there's no point in not trying and getting out there. And again, if you're applying the way I recommend, you can get out 100 and 200 resumes rather quickly, right? I think that's a month, maybe 2 months, right? To go out and see there. And then maybe another month to see if it actually, how it hits. That's when you can start to go get feedback and figure out like, okay, are people responding to me? How far through the process am I getting? Is there a lot of interest, because usually if, the rule of thumb is it's variable how often it's going to take for you to get a manager interview. If it's a really bad market, I've seen people be able to apply 200 times and not get a single call back. That's a really tough market.
For sure.
Usually on average though, you should see if you apply to 150 to 200 jobs, you should get somewhere around 4, right? I would consider that a decent number. Once you get that first manager interview, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's usually half get to the technical interview, half get an offer. That's the rule of thumb there. It's really all about getting that manager interview. But if you do that and apply out and then that doesn't work, well, we got to go to the backup plan, which is, okay, there's something up with your resume. Sometimes you get feedback. Sometimes you get told, sometimes it's a structure thing, but usually you can clean that up rather quickly. But usually it's just a lack of experience, right? You just don't have that. The thing that I try to get them to recognize, and again, this is harder for folks who are looking for a job immediately, because when you have that financial background, knocking at you, finances knocking, it's challenging. So this isn't always welcome advice, but it is true, I feel, which is just because you don't have a job doesn't mean you can't get experience. You can get experience. It just might look different than you expected, right? It will look like taking a contract role with somebody to offer them, getting them a website, going on and joining a Discord group or something that has development work and finding jobs work, finding a startup that needs a developer and working for free basically to get that up there. The point of this is not to work for free forever. You really shouldn't, right? And some people will take advantage of that and you have to be savvy to know when that's going on. But compare that to the alternative. Let's say you sent out 200 resumes and didn't get any callbacks, and you did that again, right? You could send 1,000 of these things and maybe nothing happens, right? Because there's something structural on. Versus you spend 2 months trying to apply, don't hear any callbacks, spend 2 months actually building up some experience. And again, there are so many startups, there's so many Discord communities, there's so many little shops that are looking for help on, hey, help me build a website, help me this, right? You may not pay a ton, but that's not what matters. What matters is getting the experience. And then once you're able to get that experience and start to bundle it up, that could in itself turn into more opportunities. Because again, it could get referrals. You could get other folks there. It builds up your background so that you can actually show a portfolio of, I built these things, I worked on this work. Then when you go out and say you're month 4 or 5, you can go back and say, okay, now I have experience. Now I've done something here. So I can say, I did my boot camp. I did this work as a contractor, and now I'm applying out and try it again. Your chances of getting a callback significantly grow if you're able to do that. And I've seen folks who have really done that sort of grind, and it works very, very well.
Yeah.
That's another avenue. Final thing to do if you're looking at that, and if it's not going to be raw applications and you're doing the experience, final thing is just networking. It's one of those things where this is not the be all end all to me anymore. I love networking. I love doing that.
Yeah.
But the truth is that like we're emotional animals. We connect with other people. Often if you meet the right person at the right time and they are the hiring manager, you can usually bypass that entire thing that's at the top of the line, right?
Totally.
To go there and do that and go straight to the manager interview. This actually happened with one of my hires at IBM. He was he worked at FedEx, and he started on the dock basically. He was a forklift driver, but eventually worked his way to project manager, where he was actually doing PM work. Then he wanted to go into software development, and he wanted to do that. So he went through a DevOps boot camp. I found him. I wasn't even a manager at that point. I found him. And his project was so good where he was doing all the right things. Like, and I'd never seen that in a demo, right? Where it's like, oh, he actually built a real pipeline. He actually went through these steps. He took what little he had and did the absolute most with him. And so I ended up keeping in touch with him. I talked to him once every 3 months or so because I really enjoyed speaking with him. And then the time came where I actually needed to hire someone, and I asked him to apply,
Yeah.
basically, right?
Right.
And I did that. So this is where what's funny. I don't hear for like a week or two, right? It's like, I need to hire out this position. I'm looking for this for an individual. I go back to HR. I said, hey, this person, Michael, should have applied. Did you? It's like, oh yeah, I saw his resume, but yeah, he's not really what you're looking for. And I'm like, no, I asked him to apply. Send the resume through, please. Right. And that's what happened. That's somebody I asked to apply, and HR basically, eliminated that resume because he didn't think it was worth my time.
And for
Even
those
though,
listening, they may not realize that was this HR person technical,
no, not,
right?
they're
Yeah.
not. No. So it ended up being, so eventually he went through, he got hired, and he ended up being a great team member, right? He ended up learning skill. And actually since then, like, he's gotten recruitment offers from other startups that I've been working on. He was the CTO for a company that I was advising for a bit of time. And that was his first job out. But because he knew me, that made everything a lot easier for him,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Because if I didn't know him, he never would have got an interview at IBM. Those are the three things I would do. And then really it's just, you got to work the system. That's it. You're looking to get a job, work those three things, apply, get experience, network with individuals, and just keep going until it works. That's really it.
I like your analogy of a game. I use that analogy a lot because it is a game. Like
Mm.
every place I've gotten to, I'm like, there's a game being played, whether it's negotiations or getting to the job or even circumventing the process a bit to work in your favor. You got to work all the angles. I like what you said about the experience too. We started doing that at Parsity, and it's a fine line because I'm trying to be cognizant of offering free labor to people that may take advantage of it, of course, but also making sure that students that do want to get that experience can. It's been
Right.
interesting to do. It's been fun because you're right. There's a ton of people out there. And if I was doing this like outside of Parsity, I would look at Reddit because there's a lot of founders on Reddit that need
Right.
somebody to work with them. And you can find people that want to, take your free coding skills, you know?
Yeah, you can. And it's one of those things that's challenging. Often this is personality differences. And I'm entrepreneurial in nature, and
Hmm.
I work with a lot of entrepreneurs. So like, you'll see some developers, we say work for free, and they'll be like, no, I'm never going to work for free. I'm going to be valuable and stuff there.
Yeah.
And that always irks me whenever I hear that, because it's like, okay, here's the thing. I was making a good salary. I was, looking at Coinbase as a potential role where their salaries are amazing,
Yeah.
right? For what they pay.
That's right.
I work for free. I work for free all the time. I work for free for my clients. I've done that work before. I've done that on my own. And it's one of those prerequisites to doing stuff. Nearly every founder, like one of the more innovative startups that I work with, which is a healthcare genomics company. And their founder has been working without pay for over a year. And it's
Yeah.
like, guess what? That's just the
How
nature
it
of the
goes.
game,
Yeah.
and what you do. It's not that you're trying, because there is a fine line when you're getting taken advantage of, right? And there's just
For
sometimes where it's like,
sure.
all my time's getting sucked up. But this idea that you shouldn't work for free is, let me put it this way. Well, you're not getting, ultimately, I don't care about if you work for free or get paid. The thing you need is experience, right?
Yeah.
And you're asking for a lot. Like, to you, it's just like, oh, it's just entry level. I only want to make 60, 70K or whatever. To you, it seems like a small ask, but to the market, it's like, actually, to you, it's 60, 70K. To me, it's probably closer to 100K with the onboarding,
Health
HR
insurance.
resources,
Yeah.
process, right? Insurance and all that. It's actually a really big ask.
Mhm.
And the truth is, I just don't think some people can accept that they're not worth that much yet, or you haven't found the person that's willing to pay that amount. So working for less, giving good deals, is it's just part of the world I've been a part, I've been at so long. And the truth is, if you're willing to do that work and show you work, it gets noticed, right? It gets picked up and you end up curtailing yourself into better and better opportunities.
Oh yeah, 100%. I totally believe in that. I mean, I've seen my own salary, explode over the years, and that's how I got started. I'm like, who can I possibly work with for free? Even now, if I want to learn something. I mean, I did like a failed startup where, I wasn't paid for 3 years, but it taught me a ton. I learned
Right.
AWS, React. I learned a lot of the modern web stuff that I just wasn't getting at my job. And that ultimately helped me throughout the years, even though I'd made zero money on that startup. I see it was directly contributed to all the other jobs I got going forward from there. And it helped me go from like kind of juniorish to senior level pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, just see a ton of value in that. Before I let you go, I'm curious, before I get to some hot takes, you've worked at boot camps. You have a long history in the boot camp space. Who tends to do well in boot camps, and who tends to not do so well in coding boot camps?
The people that I see that are the absolute best. Oh, how do I describe them? I have an image in my head of what they look like. Generally speaking, one, it's a cliche and they use the term like self-starter in organizations, right? Which that's not what they're actually looking for. They tend to be people who go above and beyond, but not in the way that you would think. Like usually when I think of somebody who's like, there are great students, right? And there are people who do great stuff there. Like I tended to be a really good student. I used to do material. When I went above and beyond, and usually meant material wise, you did that. The folks who did well don't tend to be that way, right? They do well in the material, but it's like they then take it on a personal challenge for themselves to push them beyond and to learn more with that. So like, the gentleman that I hired, Michael, for, IBM, he impressed me because it's like, okay, I know what you learn in your boot camps and I know what's there. And also I'm saying you're spinning up a Kubernetes cluster. You built the DevOps pipeline. You're using all these tools here. And it's like, you made the most with the materials. It's clear you learned on your own. And then 6 months later, when I talked to him, he was still working on that. He was still working on building that. He was building better and better versions of the thing that he built, which was very impressive to me. Right.
Yeah.
So he worked on that project. It was good. Those folks tend to do very well. The folks who kind of understand the grind also do very well out of boot camps. Like it's funny, salespeople who move into software do very well.
Yeah.
I find because they, especially getting the job, right?
For
Because they
sure.
understand it's a numbers game, right? They don't take it personally because they're used to getting cold calling folks and getting
That's
told
right.
to screw off, right?
Good
So
point.
for them, not hearing back is just like, yeah, that's fine. I'm
Yeah.
going to do 10, I'm going to do 10 tomorrow. I'm going to do 10 the next day. And I'm not going to stop till this works, right? So they don't really take it personally. They follow the opportunity is the other thing as well, right? Where it's like, they may start by knowing, because I think some of the folks that don't do very well are kind of looking for other folks to tell them what to focus on next. And again, when you're within the confines of the boot camp, that's good because it teaches you, because the boot camp teaches you, learn this, learn this, learn this, this, and they go. But some folks get off and it's like they lose
Now
their
what?
guardrail. I don't know what to do. So the folks who do really well kind of have that next step in mind where it's like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. They're no less certain about the future. They just don't let that be a barrier to them learning or doing this, right? Like they'll talk to me. I'll say, hey, you should read this book, learn this course, learn this program. And then they'll actually do it. And then they'll go and apply it.
Yeah.
And they'll do that. You don't have to continue to prod them. Those folks tend to do, good as well. It's not to say that the other folks can't, don't have it as well, but like the folks I just mentioned will do well regardless if it's a bad market or a good market, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sort of individual you want to be. That's the individual you want to emulate versus like, I hope you have a good market because if you don't, things are going to be very rough,
Yeah. Whether now or later.
Right. So that answer your question?
Heck yeah, man. It's right in line with what I've seen. I've worked in boot camps throughout my career. Also, I've always moonlit as a boot camp instructor, now owning Parsity. And I see the same like archetypes that tend to do really well and that tend to do not so well. And it sounds like we're pretty much in step with that, which I think is a good thing to know. I mean, ideally, Parsity, we get in people that are in that archetype that tend to do very well. But I know that that's not always the case, but it's something that you should probably if you're self-aware, it's helpful. So you don't end up, flushing a bunch of money down the toilet at some
Yeah,
program or college or whatever. All right. Got some really quick hot takes for you.
please.
Twitter versus LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. I love Twitter. I use Twitter more often, but the value is in LinkedIn. The bosses you want to talk to are there. The managers you want to talk to are there. It's a boring social network. And honestly, like there's some other social issues I'm not particularly in love with LinkedIn. Neither Twitter, but like, I find Twitter to be more fun, but it's like, that's where the value. I'll say this. When somebody uses Twitter, that's the place where you can get a really big audience. If somebody wants to build a business or find a job, they use LinkedIn. This is very hard to monetize. You can find industry wise, you can find some folks on there, right? Like if you're in Web3, my answer would or Twitter. That's where they are and that's where they message. But like 95% of industries, LinkedIn is going to be a better choice.
It's funny. Most people have said that, and I'm surprised. I feel the same way too. But
Mhm.
I think glad to know I'm not alone. Getting a job versus being an entrepreneur.
Get a job. Like it's funny. I say that where it's like, I'm not an entrepreneur because I really want to be. So, I mean, obviously I do, but, I'll give that. So like, I was actually like, there's a lot of entrepreneurs that I know, my co-founder, for example, Garrett, he can't work a job. I mean, he's done it. He's worked at Tesla. He's worked at all these places, but it's just like, he wants to rip his hair out of his head by working there. I mean, it's a really thing there. And there's some entrepreneurs who are just, they're unemployable. Me, I'm not that way. I was wonderful inside the IBM system.
Yeah,
I did incredibly well. I had a job. It was a good thing. But the thing that stopped me is that one, I had the opportunity to leave if I wanted to, where I wasn't bound by the job. And two, it's just, it wasn't exciting to me. It wasn't like being a VP at IBM just didn't drive me. It didn't do anything. And
interesting.
so like, I had this discussion with my brother actually, who he, wanted to start his own agency. He wanted to do that. And eventually he's like, this is too much work. He wanted a job and he was fine working a job. And it's like, it's easy. You're told what to do. You find it. At that point, it's more about finding the right culture fit, the right bosses and things. And you can find those things. Really, the people who are entrepreneurial, like people think if you're really lucky or really want to be rich or whatever, you should be on entrepreneurship. And that you get some of those folks in there. Most entrepreneurs are there because they can't do anything else. Either the vision they want to do is so big, they're so unemployable, this is the only thing that's going to get them paid, or they're just like, they literally are just so bored by a job they couldn't possibly imagine doing it. They're doing it. So it's less like they choose that role and more like it's the only option left. So I would say do a job until something hits you in the head where like you can't do this.
I love that take. Because I don't really consider myself an entrepreneur. I own this coding boot camp. I also like what I do a lot, and I tend to do pretty well in a structured organization, I've found.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I still feel like I have more room to grow on that other end of the more traditional route. I like the entrepreneur. Like, there's a lot of room for people that want to innovate within a company. It's certain
Oh
companies.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and they're very necessary when a company gets above a certain size. The CEO knows, and usually the number is somewhere between 50 and 100 million, basically. Where it's like if you want to grow beyond that, you can't be the only person with ideas. You
Yeah.
scale out, you get out, or your idea you don't have enough ideas, so it then becomes recruitment, and you do actually need people who have those good ideas, right? And there's this whole class of individuals who are somewhat entrepreneurial, ambitious, but like the stability of the job and will be working a job, but they have enough of that edge where they do that. And they're critical for any organization that wants to grow. So that is a perfectly valid path forward.
Yeah. Hey, it's been really awesome talking to you. This has been excellent advice. It's been really cool hearing your story. I know there's a lot of lessons people can take away from here.
I'm
Um,
glad.
I know that on LinkedIn, you don't talk as much about this stuff as you do now about your own business, but if people do want to connect with you, where should they find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm linkedin.com-in-Schuster. Basically, I'm the guy with the black cowboy hat. You'll know that when you get to the profile picture. Honestly, like I said, I talk about growth because that's my business. That's everything. That's what I do. But honestly, I love helping folks in this field. So if anyone from your audience has questions, feel free to connect with me and ask me questions. I am always happy to take those.
Yeah, you're super genuine, super helpful, and always like willing to. You've helped me out personally. You've helped out a lot of students at Parsity. Just a great overall person to know and connect with. So Thanks a lot. Really appreciate you spending time today with us.
Very welcome. Thank you, Brian.
That'll do it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. To learn more about becoming a software engineer with us, then check out parsity.io. If you're not quite ready for that, then jump into our dev30.xyz program, which is 30 days of working on your mindset, habits, and JavaScript skills. Totally worth it. See you next week.